November 7, 1944. Camp McCain, Mississippi. The rain fell in sheets across the barbed wire perimeter, turning the red clay into rivers of rust-colored mud. Inside the prisoner of war compound, 300 German officers, men who had commanded panzer divisions across North Africa, who had orchestrated the defense of Normandy's beaches, who had signed orders affecting the lives of millions, stood in formation under guard, their gray uniforms darkened by moisture, their faces carved from disbelief. They had been informed through translators whose voices carried across the parade ground with bureaucratic precision that they would be transported to the nearby town of Grenada to observe something their captors called a free election. The announcement was met with silence, not the silence of submission but of incomprehension. Elections, they understood, plebiscites orchestrated by the Ministry of Propaganda, rallies where outcomes were determined before the first ballot was cast, theatrical displays of unity under the gaze of the state. But this, their American guards insisted, would be different. The officers exchanged glances that spoke a shared language of skepticism. They were about to witness something that would shatter every assumption they had carried across the Atlantic, every certainty about power, governance, and the nature of political order itself. The German officer corps of 1944 represented the culmination of a particular vision of authority, hierarchical, militarized, absolute. These were men educated in the Prussian tradition, where the state existed as an organism of pure will, where democracy was dismissed as the weakness of Western decadence, the chaos of parliamentary squabbling that had destroyed the Weimar Republic and necessitated the rise of a Führer. They had been taught in the academies of Berlin and Munich, in the war colleges, and through the texts of Clausewitz and Ludendorff, that governance required strength, singular vision, the elimination of dissent. The American system, as they understood it from propaganda broadcasts and ideological instruction, was a plutocracy, a nation controlled by Jewish financiers and industrialists, where the common people were manipulated by media and capital, where elections were merely theater to disguise oligarchic control. The camps where they now resided told a different story, though they struggled to interpret it. The American guards rotated regularly, following union schedules and labor regulations. Officers observed that enlisted men spoke back to their superiors, not with insubordination, but with a casual equality that seemed impossible under any functional military system. Newspapers arrived daily, uncensored, filled with criticism of President Roosevelt, debates about military strategy, open discussion of failures and defeats. The camp library contained books banned throughout the Reich, works of political philosophy, histories of revolution, treatises on constitutional governance. The International Red Cross inspected freely, without prior notice or prepared routes. Most confounding was the treatment of the prisoners themselves. According to the Geneva Convention, which the Americans followed with legalistic precision, the officers received pay for work, could write uncensored letters, were provided with the same rations as American soldiers. The commandant, a colonel from Iowa, held weekly meetings where prisoners could voice complaints about conditions. These complaints were recorded, investigated, addressed. When a prisoner filed a grievance about inadequate heating, the matter went to the War Department. 3 weeks later, additional coal stoves arrived. This was not the behavior of a regime. It was something else entirely, something their ideological training had not prepared them to recognize. As the trucks arrived to transport them to observe the election, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, formerly of the 21st Panzer Division, turned to his fellow officers and spoke what many were thinking. They are showing us this to humiliate us, to prove their system superior. Oberst Friedrich Weber, who had commanded artillery at Kasserine Pass, replied quietly, "Or they genuinely believe we should see it." The town of Grenada, Mississippi, appeared on that November morning as an ordinary American municipality. Population 9,000, courthouse square dominated by a Confederate monument, storefronts advertising hardware and dry goods, the smell of wood smoke and coffee drifting from the cafes. The German officers, transported in canvas-covered trucks under minimal guard, stepped into a scene that defied every category their minds possessed for understanding civic life. There were no troops massing in the streets, no party officials in uniform, no loudspeakers broadcasting instructions. Instead, citizens moved with casual purpose toward a brick building marked polling station, carrying umbrellas against the rain, chatting with neighbors, corralling children who darted between legs. The prisoners were positioned on the courthouse steps, given a vantage point to observe the voting process. What they witnessed first was not the vote itself, but the preparation. Election volunteers, ordinary citizens, not government officials, checked registration lists, explained procedures to voters, answered questions with patient courtesy. An elderly black man approached the registration desk. Several German officers tensed, anticipating confrontation, violence, the enforcement of racial hierarchy they assumed governed American society. Instead, the volunteer checked his name, confirmed his registration, and directed him to a voting booth. The man disappeared behind a curtain, emerged 2 minutes later, deposited his ballot in a sealed box, and departed. "They allow Negroes to vote?" Lieutenant Hans Bruckner whispered, his face drained of color. He had been educated at Heidelberg, had absorbed the racial theories that formed the ideological foundation of the Reich. The scene before him contradicted not merely policy, but what he understood as natural law. An American guard, a corporal from Wisconsin who spoke functional German, overheard. "In most states, yes. If they're citizens and registered, same as anyone." The simplicity of his tone suggested he found nothing remarkable in the statement. The prisoners watched as a factory worker in overalls voted, followed by a woman in a business suit, then a farmer still wearing mud-caked boots, then a young man barely out of his teens. No one checked their loyalty. No one demanded to know their politics before allowing them to enter. The booths were curtained, private, unsupervised. Oberst Weber found himself whispering a question to the corporal. "Who do they vote for?" The American shrugged. "Whoever they want. Secret ballot. That's the whole point." The answer hung in the air between them like a physical thing, dense and incomprehensible. Whoever they want. The whole point. The first profound dissonance occurred when a voting machine malfunctioned. A mechanical lever jammed, preventing a voter, a middle-aged woman carrying a grocery basket, from completing her ballot. The woman called to a volunteer who examined the machine, then summoned the election supervisor. Within minutes, 3 citizens huddled around the device discussing solutions. One was a mechanic, called over from his shop across the square. They debated, tested, finally removed the machine from service and replaced it with a backup. The entire process took 12 minutes. No one consulted higher authority. No official arrived from the state capital. The citizens simply solved the problem, documented it for the record, and continued. Hauptmann Richter, trained in the importance of centralized command, found the scene almost obscene in its casual disregard for hierarchy. "Who authorized them to make that decision?" he asked the Wisconsin corporal. "Authorized? They're election volunteers. It's their job. But who supervises them?" "The county clerk, technically. But she trusts them to handle it. And if they manipulate the machine? Alter votes?" The corporal looked at him with something between pity and amusement. "There are observers from both parties watching. Plus, the machines get audited after. You can't really cheat without lots of people noticing." The concept of distributed oversight, not surveillance from above, but mutual accountability among equals, was alien to men who understood power as a pyramid descending from a singular apex. In the Reich, elections required mobilization, coordination, the presence of party officials at every level to ensure correct outcomes. Here, ordinary citizens administered the process, argued about procedures, corrected each other's mistakes, and somehow, the system functioned. More voters arrived as morning progressed into afternoon. The prisoners watched a young soldier, home on leave, vote for the first time in his life. His mother accompanied him explaining the process, then waited outside while he made his choices in private. They watched a heated discussion between 2 men, apparently disagreeing about a local referendum, conducted on the courthouse steps with raised voices and emphatic gestures, then watched them shake hands and depart in opposite directions. No one intervened. No one arrested them for public dispute. "This is chaos," Lieutenant Bruckner said, though his voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. "They have no discipline." Oberst Weber, older, more observant, replied slowly, "Or they have a discipline we don't recognize, one that doesn't require force." The words felt dangerous even as he spoke them, like a door opening onto a landscape his maps had never charted. That evening returned to Camp McCain. The officers gathered in the barracks and spoke in low voices about what they had witnessed. The discussion carried the intensity of men encountering evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Some retreated into familiar explanations. The election was theater, carefully staged for prisoner observation. The citizens coached, and the outcomes predetermined. Others, less certain, admitted they had seen no evidence of coercion, no signs of rehearsal. The voting had possessed an organic quality, mundane and chaotic, that seemed impossible to fabricate. Oberst Weber requested permission to access the camp library, and to the surprise of many, the request was granted within an hour. He emerged with his arms full of books: The Federalist Papers, Democracy in America, by Alexis de Tocqueville, Histories of the American Revolution, constitutional law textbooks. He spread them across a table in the common area and began to read, making notes in the margins of paper provided by the guards. Other officers drifted over, curious despite themselves. What they discovered in those texts was a theory of government that inverted everything their education had taught them. Authority, according to these American documents, did not descend from the state to the people, but rose from the people to the state. Government existed not as an expression of national will or racial destiny, but as a practical instrument, constrained by law, subject to revision, deliberately divided against itself to prevent the concentration of power. The citizens they had observed voting were not subjects granted privileges by a benevolent authority. They were sovereigns, delegating temporary power to representatives who could be removed. Listen to this, Weber read aloud, translating into German. Governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Consent. Not blood, not destiny, not the will of history. Consent. Hauptmann Richter, who had led men across the sands of Libya, who had signed execution orders for partisans in Italy, felt something crack inside his chest. That cannot work. People are not capable of self-governance. They need leadership, structure, someone to make decisions. And yet, Weber replied, gesturing at the books, it has worked for 170 years. Through civil war, industrial revolution, global conflict. This republic of farmers and shopkeepers has built the most powerful military and industrial complex in human history. Perhaps we are the ones who misunderstood what people are capable of. The camp commandant, Colonel Thomas Harrison, was a peculiar type of American officer, a lawyer in civilian life, a believer in the redemptive power of education, a man who saw the prisoners not merely as enemies to be contained, but as potential converts to democratic principles. He instituted a program of lectures and discussions, voluntary but well-attended, covering American history, constitutional theory, and comparative government. The lectures were delivered by university professors from nearby colleges, by visiting officials from the State Department, by soldiers who had studied political science before the war. One lecture, delivered by a professor from Ole Miss, examined the American Civil War. The prisoners listened with intense attention as the professor described how the nation had torn itself apart over the question of slavery, how 600,000 men had died, how the Republic had survived by expanding the definition of citizenship to include the formerly enslaved. We are not a perfect democracy, the professor said, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners. We have failed our ideals repeatedly, but the system allows for correction, for amendment, for the gradual expansion of rights. That is its genius. Not perfection, but the mechanism for self-improvement. After the lecture, Hauptmann Richter approached the professor with a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. If your system is so flexible, so open to change, how does it maintain order? How do you prevent chaos, revolution, the collapse of authority? The professor considered the question seriously. We don't prevent it entirely. We channel it. Dissent is expressed through petition, protest, voting, legal challenges. When the pressure builds too high, we amend the Constitution, pass new laws, elect different leaders. The system bends rather than breaks. But surely there are limits. Ideas too dangerous to allow. People too subversive to tolerate. The professor smiled sadly. Yes, we've imposed limits, often shamefully. We've imprisoned dissenters, suppressed speech, betrayed our principles under the excuse of security. But the structure of our law makes such violations difficult to sustain. Someone can challenge them in court. The press exposes them. Eventually, usually the system corrects itself. Richter walked away troubled. The professor had not claimed perfection, had in fact acknowledged deep failures. Yet he spoke with confidence in the system's fundamental resilience. It was not the confidence of ideology, of faith in a Führer's vision, but something stranger. Confidence in a process, in the aggregate wisdom of millions making individual choices. in the possibility of improvement through collective action. The internal conflict deepening within many of the prisoners was not merely intellectual, but existential. They had sworn oaths to Hitler, had participated in a system that demanded absolute loyalty, had witnessed, and in some cases, participated in, acts that they had justified through ideology and duty. To accept that the American system might be legitimate, might actually function better than the totalitarian model, required admitting that their entire adult lives had been built on a foundation of lies. Lieutenant Bruckner, the youngest of the senior officers, experienced something close to psychological collapse. He had joined the Hitler Youth at 10, had absorbed the racial theories and leadership principles without question, had been commissioned at 22, and sent to command a mechanized infantry unit in France. Everything he understood about strength, about manhood, about the nature of political order, derived from National Socialist doctrine. Now watching American democracy function with casual efficiency, seeing black soldiers guard white prisoners without incident, observing citizens criticize their government openly without consequence, he felt the architecture of his worldview crumbling. He sought out Oberst Weber, found him reading in the library. "How can you study their propaganda with such seriousness?" Bruckner demanded, his voice raw. "It's designed to break us, to make us doubt everything we fought for." Weber looked up, his eyes heavy with something that might have been compassion. "Because, Lieutenant, I am beginning to suspect it is not propaganda. I think they actually believe these things. More troubling, I think they might be correct." "That's treason," Bruckner whispered. "Treason against what?" Weber replied. "The Führer is dead or in hiding. The Reich is defeated. We are prisoners in a foreign land, watching their system function while ours has collapsed into ash. At what point does loyalty become delusion?" The words hung between them like an abyss. Bruckner felt tears burning in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from the terrible vertigo of lost certainty. That night, Bruckner requested a meeting with the camp chaplain, an American Methodist minister who spoke German and served as a counselor for prisoners experiencing psychological distress. The chaplain listened for 2 hours as Bruckner poured out his confusion, his rage, his sense of betrayal, not by his captors, but by his own leaders, his own education, the entire structure of meaning that had guided his youth. When Bruckner finally exhausted himself, the chaplain said simply, "The truth is not your enemy, it's your liberation." By spring of 1945, with Germany's surrender confirmed and the full scope of the Holocaust becoming known through newsreels and newspaper reports, the educational program at Camp McCain intensified. The American authorities believed, with a naivety that some historians would later question, that exposure to democratic principles and evidence of Nazi atrocities could re-educate the officer corps, prepare them to help rebuild a democratic Germany. Selected prisoners were shown films from liberated concentration camps, were given access to testimony from survivors, were confronted with documented evidence of systematic genocide. The reaction split the prisoner population. Some refused to believe, insisted the evidence was fabricated, Allied propaganda designed to justify the war and humiliate the German people. Others accepted the evidence but claimed ignorance. They had been soldiers, not politicians. They had followed orders. They had known nothing of the camps. A smaller group, including Oberst Weber, faced the evidence directly and experienced something like moral devastation. Weber requested a private meeting with Colonel Harrison. They sat in the commandant's office, drinking coffee, speaking in a mixture of German and English. "I commanded artillery," Weber said, his voice flat. "I destroyed cities, I killed civilians. I told myself it was necessary, that war required such things, that the cause justified the means. But I had absorbed the ideology, the idea that some lives mattered less, that the strong had a right to dominate the weak, that mercy was weakness." He paused, staring at his hands. "Your democracy is built on the opposite premise, that every person has inherent worth, that power must be constrained by law and consent, that the strong have obligations to the weak, not rights over them." Harrison listened without interruption. When Weber finished, the colonel spoke carefully. "Democracy isn't just a system of government. It's a moral framework. It assumes human equality not because we're all the same, but because no one is wise enough, good enough, to be trusted with absolute power over others. We divide authority, require consent, protect rights, not because people are perfect, but precisely because they're not." Weber nodded slowly. "In your election, I saw ordinary people making decisions about their common life, not perfectly, not always wisely, but peacefully. The butcher and the professor, the black man and the white woman, all equal under law, all participating. I have spent 20 years believing such a system was impossible, weak, degenerate. I was wrong. The admission cost him something profound, the last fragments of the certainty he had carried into war. The convergence of intellectual understanding and personal transformation occurred differently for each prisoner, but a pattern emerged. Those who engaged seriously with democratic theory, who observed American society with open minds, who wrestled with the moral implications of their service to the Reich, began to experience something the camp psychologists called ideological conversion. It was not sudden, not a moment of revelation, but a gradual reconstruction of fundamental assumptions about power, governance, and human nature. A group of officers, led by Weber, petitioned Colonel Harrison for permission to form a study group focused on constitutional democracy. The request was granted. They met 3 evenings per week, reading texts ranging from ancient Greek philosophy to modern political theory, debating the nature of sovereignty, the balance between freedom and order, the mechanisms that prevented democratic systems from descending into mob rule or tyranny. American professors visited to lead discussions, answer questions, challenge assumptions. The most heated debates centered on the question of leadership. The Prussian military tradition emphasized the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, the idea that organizations functioned best under hierarchical authority, where orders flowed downward without question. Democracy, by contrast, distributed authority, required consensus, moved slowly through debate and compromise. How could such a system respond to crisis? How could it act decisively when action was needed? An American political science professor, invited to address the study group, offered a response that struck many prisoners as paradoxical. Democratic systems are slow in peacetime, which is a feature, not a bug. The slowness forces deliberation, prevents hasty decisions, protects against tyranny. But in genuine crisis, when the people perceive existential threat, democracies can mobilize with terrifying speed and total commitment. Look at American industrial production since 1941. We built more ships, planes, tanks, and munitions than the rest of the world combined, not through force but through voluntary coordination and shared purpose. Hauptmann Richter, who had spent months resisting these ideas, finally spoke a truth that had been growing in him. The difference is consent. Your workers built weapons because they chose to support the war. Ours built them under threat and surveillance. Both systems produced weapons, but only one created workers who took pride in quality, who innovated, who worked overtime voluntarily. Consent makes people powerful in ways coercion cannot. The study group fell silent. The insight was obvious, once stated, but it undermined everything their military training had taught about motivation and discipline. As summer approached and discussions of repatriation began, the prisoners faced a practical question. What would they do with their newfound understanding? Germany lay in ruins, occupied by 4 powers, divided between East and West, its future uncertain. The officers who had undergone ideological transformation understood they had a choice: return to Germany and try to build something new, or remain silent, retreat into private life, let others determine the nation's future. Colonel Harrison called a meeting of the study group. He laid out what the American occupation authorities were planning: denazification programs, constitutional conventions, the establishment of democratic institutions in the Western zones. We need Germans who understand democracy, Harrison said bluntly, not to implement American policy, but to build authentic German democratic culture. You men have the education, the leadership experience, the credibility with your fellow citizens. You could be instrumental in reconstruction. The proposal was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as collaboration, a betrayal of their fellow Germans who had suffered in the war. Others recognized it as an opportunity, perhaps a responsibility. Oberst Weber spoke for many when he said, "We led men into a criminal war in service of an evil ideology. We bear responsibility for that. Perhaps this is our chance at redemption, not through words or apologies, but through concrete action to ensure Germany never again descends into tyranny." The discussion that followed ranged across practical and philosophical terrain. How could they convince their countrymen that democracy was not a foreign imposition, but a system that protected their interests? How could they build trust in institutions after 12 years of totalitarian rule and the catastrophic defeat it produced? How could they promote equality and rights in a culture that had celebrated hierarchy and obedience? Lieutenant Bruckner, who had traveled furthest from his starting beliefs, offered an insight. We tell them what we learned, that we were taught democracy was weak and we were wrong, that we believed a strong man could solve our problems and it led to destruction, that we saw an alternative, messy, slow, frustrating, but stable and just. We don't lecture them from authority. We share our transformation, admit our mistakes, and trust them to draw their own conclusions. The simplicity of the approach appealed to the group. They were not missionaries bringing enlightenment to the ignorant, but fellow Germans who had learned a hard lesson and wanted to share it. Testimony rather than teaching. Witness rather than propaganda. The confrontation that crystallized everything occurred in late August, during a visit from a Wehrmacht general who had been captured in the final days of the war. General Erich von Manstein, a decorated officer of the old school, was touring American POW camps before his own internment at Nuremberg for war crimes trials. He met with the officers at Camp McCain, expecting to find men maintaining their military bearing and National Socialist principles despite captivity. Instead, he encountered Weber's study group. The general listened with growing anger as the officers described their embrace of democratic theory, their criticism of the Nazi regime, their plans to participate in building a democratic Germany. "Have you lost your minds?" von Manstein shouted. "Have you no loyalty, no honor? You speak like collaborators, like traitors to everything we fought for." Weber stood to respond, his voice steady. "General, we fought for a lie. We followed orders that led to genocide and total defeat. Our loyalty enabled monstrous crimes. If that is honor, then I reject honor. I choose truth instead." The room fell silent. To speak thus to a superior officer violated every military convention, every hierarchy the Prussian tradition held sacred. Von Manstein's face purpled. "You dare—" "Yes, I dare," Weber interrupted, "because I have seen an alternative. I watched American citizens govern themselves without a Führer. I saw black men and white men vote side by side. I read their constitution and understood that law can constrain power, that rights can be protected, that people can be trusted with freedom. Everything we were taught was a lie, and our loyalty to that lie destroyed our nation." The general's response was cold. "Then you are no longer Germans." Hauptmann Richter stood beside Weber. "No, General. We are finally Germans who understand what Germany must become to survive. A nation of laws, not men. A democracy, not a dictatorship. A people who choose their leaders rather than worship them. You can call that betrayal. We call it learning from catastrophic failure." Von Manstein left without another word. But his visit clarified something for the study group. They would face resistance not just from former Nazis, but from traditional conservatives who saw democracy as foreign, weak, unsuited to German culture. The work ahead would be harder than they had imagined, but the encounter also strengthened their resolve. They had crossed a line, burned bridges behind them, committed themselves to a vision of Germany's future that many would denounce as treason. The final weeks at Camp McCain were spent in intensive preparation. The officers who had committed to democratic reconstruction studied the specifics of constitutional design, electoral systems, federalism, judicial review. American experts arrived to conduct workshops on practical governance, how to run a town council meeting, how to organize a political party, how to write legislation, how to protect minority rights while respecting majority rule. The education was granular, technical, focused on the mechanics of democratic practice rather than abstract theory. What emerged was a document, unofficial, collective, written by the study group as a synthesis of what they had learned. They called it Observations on Democracy, Lessons from Captivity. It was not a political platform or constitutional proposal, but a reflection on the principles they had discovered and their applicability to German reconstruction. The document was practical, acknowledging the difficulties of implementing democracy in a nation with authoritarian traditions, but insistent that the attempt was both necessary and possible. Key passages reflected the transformation they had undergone. Democracy is not the rule of the mob, but the rule of law applied equally to all. It is not weakness, but the strength of a society that trusts its citizens with power. It is not chaos, but ordered liberty, where disagreement is resolved through debate rather than force. Democracy assumes not that humans are good, but that concentrated power corrupts even the best intentions, and therefore power must be divided, checked, subject to revision by those it governs. Colonel Harrison read the document with visible emotion. "Gentlemen," he said when he finished, "you have traveled farther than most men travel in a lifetime. You came here as enemies, prisoners of war, believing in a system that promised strength through unity and delivered catastrophe. You leave as, I won't say friends, that's too simple, but as men who understand that freedom and justice are not weaknesses, but foundations of enduring strength." The repatriation orders arrived in September. The officers would return to Germany in stages, to the British and American zones, where they would face denazification proceedings, tribunal evaluations, uncertain futures. But they would return with something unexpected, not bitterness or resentment, but a conviction forged in observation, study, and honest confrontation with their own past. They had witnessed democracy function. They had seen its messy vitality, its capacity for self-correction, its respect for human dignity. And they believed, against all their training, against all their assumptions, that Germany could embrace such a system and thrive. The moment of ultimate recognition came not in a lecture hall or through a book, but during the final formation before departure. The prisoners stood in ranks, their few possessions packed, their service records reviewed, their return to Germany imminent. Colonel Harrison gave a brief speech thanking them for their cooperation, wishing them success in the difficult work of reconstruction. Then he did something unprecedented. He invited Oberst Weber to address the assembled prisoners. Weber walked to the front, faced men who had been his comrades, subordinates, fellow believers in a cause now revealed as catastrophic delusion. "We came here as prisoners of war," he began, "defeated but unbroken, still believing in the principles that had guided us. Some of us still believe those things, but others," he gestured to the study group standing nearby, "others have undergone a transformation that I can only describe as painful rebirth." He spoke about the election in Grenada, about the black man voting, about the woman in the business suit and the farmer in muddy boots, all equal before the law, all participating in self-governance. He spoke about reading the Constitution, about learning that authority could flow upward from the people rather than downward from a leader. He spoke about confronting evidence of the Holocaust, about accepting responsibility, about choosing truth over loyalty to a failed ideology. "The Americans defeated us militarily," Weber said, his voice carrying across the silent formation. "That was expected. They had more men, more weapons, more industrial capacity, but they have also defeated us ideologically, and that defeat is more profound because it was voluntary. I chose to study their system. I chose to question my beliefs. I chose to accept that I was wrong about fundamental things, about human nature, about governance, about power and freedom." He paused, looking at faces that showed everything from agreement to rage to confusion. "We returned to Germany not as conquerors, but as students. We learned something here that our military academies never taught, that the strongest societies are built not on obedience but on consent, not on racial purity, but on legal equality, not on the will of a leader, but on the collective wisdom of free citizens. Some of you will reject this. Others will consider it. A few perhaps will join us in trying to build a Germany worthy of the lessons we learned in captivity." The formation dissolved in silence. Men shook hands or turned away. The division was clear: those who had changed and those who refused to change. History would judge which group shaped Germany's future. They returned to a Germany that no longer existed, not the Greater Reich of their imagination, but a devastated landscape of rubble and occupation, a nation divided between East and West, its future uncertain. Many of the officers who had studied democracy at Camp McCain found roles in the reconstruction. Weber became an advisor to the Constitutional Convention in the Western Zones, helping draft the basic law that would govern the Federal Republic. Richter worked with American authorities establishing local government in Bavaria. Even young Bruckner, the true believer turned convert, took a position teaching civics in a Hamburg gymnasium, determined that the next generation would understand what he had learned too late. They faced resistance, from former Nazis who saw them as traitors, from communists in the East who dismissed democracy as capitalist exploitation, from traditional conservatives who considered Anglo-American political systems unsuited to German culture. But they persisted, armed with testimony rather than theory, sharing their own transformations rather than lecturing from authority. "I believed democracy was weak," they told skeptical audiences, "and I was wrong. I saw it function. I studied its principles. I understand now that it offers the only path to lasting peace and prosperity. The Federal Republic that emerged in 1949 bore their fingerprints, a parliamentary system with strong federalism, constitutional protections for human rights, mechanisms to prevent the concentration of power, eternal clauses preventing future amendments that might restore dictatorship. It was not a perfect democracy, but it was genuine, and it endured. Through decades of prosperity, reunification, and integration into the European community, the system held. In later years, historians would debate the effectiveness of the re-education programs, would question American assumptions about converting enemy officers through exposure to democratic practice. But the officers themselves, those who had stood in the rain watching citizens vote in Grenada, Mississippi, who had studied late into the night reading the Federalist Papers, who had wrestled with the collapse of their ideological certainty, knew that something profound had occurred. They had arrived as prisoners of war. They departed as witnesses to an alternative vision of political order, one that honored human dignity, constrained power through law, and trusted people to govern themselves. The war taught them about power, defeat taught them about consequences, but captivity in America taught them about democracy, and that lesson, learned in prison camps far from home, helped shape a nation's rebirth. They came as conquerors. They returned as builders of a freer Germany.